clinical indicators are the language of the body. That's a way that we can score how a woman feels, because you can't just go by labs. That used to be the way that we did it, but we want to know how a woman felt. Clinical indicators can be looked at as physical clues, mental clues, emotional clues, behavioral clues. Those are just clues that give the doctor information, the prescriber and the hormone coach information about what really needs to be adjusted with the patient. Hello, everyone. You're listening to the MeNoPause Moxie Podcast, where we strategically challenge the status quo on perimenopause, menopause, and female hormone balancing. I'm Marie Hoig, and I'm here with my producer and co-host, Maggie Kuhn. Welcome to the show. Today, we're diving into one of the most important parts of the hormone balancing process, something most women have never heard of: clinical indicators. If you've ever wondered how we really know when your hormones are balanced, this episode is for you, because hormonal balance isn't a guessing game or a crapshoot. It's a destination meeting certain clinical criteria. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what clinical indicators are and how to track them and how we use them to help us find your hormone sweet spot. Hey, Maggie, nice to see you today.
Hey, Marie. So before we get into talking about our topic today of clinical indicators, could you please, just for our listeners and to level set, explain what you mean by hormonal balance?
Sure. Hormonal balance, or what we refer to as the hormone sweet spot, is when all of your depleted hormones have been fully restored and you can't imagine feeling any better than you do. And hormonal balance is really measured with a couple of things: blood work and clinical indicators. And today we're talking about the clinical indicator part of it.
Okay, so how did you come up with this concept of clinical indicators?
Many years ago, working in the hormone clinic, I noticed certain patterns that patients were exhibiting when they took hormone therapy. And initially, when you give a person hormones, they feel pretty good, and they start talking about how good they feel. And at the same time, women can experience some what we call negative clinical indicators, things that don't feel as good, like say breast tenderness or a mild headache or bloating. And that's how we refer to these clinical indicators, positive or negative. So patients are telling me how good they were feeling, but yet on the other hand, they would say, "Oh, but my boobs hurt, but yet I don't care because I feel so good." So there was this give and take when it came to symptoms. But I also saw, as the months progressed, that depending on the type of HRT a patient is taking, first, second, third, or fourth generation hormone therapy, they can have different experiences with these clinical indicators, both positive and negative. And so then I started to track them, mostly because patients tend to forget how bad they felt when they first started hormone therapy. And also, we wanted to know, why were these hormones not working any longer? Why was the patient feeling good in the beginning and now they're not? And then we had to track at the point where they stopped feeling good and measure blood work there as well. So we were trying to gather data so that we can really get the hormones balanced in for the patient.
Because often lab results don't always match how a woman's feeling. Is that correct?
That is correct. You can't just go by labs. They used to tell us that years ago when we first were learning this, but because a woman will feel good straight away, as I mentioned, but yet that peters out in a few weeks, but the patient's still on hormones. So it's confusing for the doctor and for the patient. The doctor's like, "Well, you're on hormones. You were feeling good and now you're not. I don't know why." And we were, tired of reaching this with just about every patient on first and second generation HRT systems. And so then we wanted to learn how to dial those hormones in so that we can reduce the negative clinical indicators and increase the positive clinical indicators. How a woman feels, and this is what we learned in this, is how a woman feels works in real time of her labs. So if a woman is having a lot of negative clinical indicators, well, it'll show in her lab work, and usually through her estrogen. Her estrogen would be low. When a woman is feeling really good and on top of the world, then her estrogen's probably pretty close to her hormone sweet spot lab-wise.
Mm-hmm. So you've said before in your clinical experience as a hormone coach that you would see women whose labs did look fine, but they weren't feeling great. So this sort of tipped you off that something wasn't matching up here.
It really was, because we couldn't explain it. And then when we would go to the conferences and talk to our mentors, and we would say, "Okay, our patients felt good in the beginning. They now no longer feel good. We're now measuring that time spot to be somewhere between 3 to 9 months for the majority of women. How do you account for that? Like, how do we fix that? And this was one of our shockers, is that we didn't get any answers. We got a lot of vague redirects, but then it bothered me because just about everybody at the hormone conferences act like they were the one, they really knew what was going on. But when I would ask doctors, what do you do when the hormones stop working? What do you mean? Well, they stop working. They do in 3 to 9 months. Yeah, well, now we're managing symptoms that the hormones weren't able to fix. And then I would say, yes, but they did in the beginning. And this is what I'm talking about. They did in the beginning, but they're not now. And nobody else was measuring this decline, you're on the same hormone therapy. It worked fine when you started and you're on it 6 months out. You don't feel good, but you still have the same lab levels and you're on the same HRT system. And so I just found this to be really confusing. And that's why I wanted to really pinpoint what's going on. When do the negative clinical indicators return or show up? And when do the positive clinical indicators diminish? And why is that? And then that was really the beginning of really digging around. Not, like I said, not to mention women, when they get to their hormone sweet spot, they forgot how bad things were. Oh, I feel fine. I've always felt fine. No, you have not always felt fine. That's one of the reasons, because people, they do tend to forget how bad things were. And if you have it down on a spreadsheet on what the clinical indicators are and match that up against lab work, then you can see with your own eyes. Anybody, a researcher, a patient, a doctor, anybody can look to see the data. And I just found this interesting because I needed something to identify the patient's experience by how they were feeling, how they were behaving, what they were saying, how they were sleeping. And so this was just the best way. So I put together just a Likert chart of scoring from 0 to 4, how a patient feels. And that was really the beginning of the tracking of clinical indicators in our clinic.
So you were really tracking both labs and clinical indicators and sort of looking at the intersection of those two things.
Well, yes, that's how we know estrogen works in real time. I'll tell you something. I could probably count on one hand how many doctors understand that estrogen works in real time with how a woman feels. And this is how we figure this out. When a woman is feeling horrible or she's having a complete emotional meltdown, we would draw blood work and we would consistently see that those estrogen levels will be in the double digits. Women don't fall apart when their estrogen is in the closer to the optimal ranges. And this is where we really started to see, oh my gosh, these are the changes that take place. And women feel better and better and better and better. And the negative clinical indicators go away, and diminish to the point where the majority of them are gone or significantly improved. So yeah, that's the long answer to your question. Yeah, hormones work in real time with how a woman feels. So you just can't take lab work, because you can get that lab work 2 weeks later. And that was the problem we were having. Patients would take lab work. We'd see the patients 2 weeks later. The lab said one thing, but the patients were telling us something different 2 weeks later. And this was the difference between the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And so then we're putting these connections together. Then we were very specific on when in a woman's she drew her blood. And then we had the patients take the clinical indicator assessment the morning of their blood draw so that we can get estrogen as close to real time and other hormones as close to real time as possible. And then we match that with the clinical indicators. That's how we're so confident with that hormone sweet spot.
So that clinical indicator assessment is that scoring of symptoms that you talked about.
Yeah, it's a pretty easy way of a scoring system. It's simple. We score the top 50 symptoms or things that are associated with menopause and perimenopause. And I say top 50 because there are hundreds of side effects of hormone deficiency that women experience.
Okay, Marie, let's break down clinical indicators, what they are and why they matter so much.
Clinical indicators are the language of the body. That's a way that we can score how a woman feels, because you can't just go by labs. That used to be the way that we did it, but we want to know how a woman felt. Clinical indicators can be looked at as physical clues, mental clues, emotional clues, behavioral clues. Those are just clues that give the doctor information, the prescriber and the hormone coach information about what really needs to be adjusted with the patient.
So there are negative and positive clinical indicators, I just heard you say.
Yep.
Okay, can you talk a little bit more about what the negative clinical indicators are?
Yeah, so negative clinical indicators are those things that you experience that just don't feel good. And a patient can come in already with negative clinical indicators. It's not hormone therapy that necessarily gives the clinical indicators. A woman can come in with migraines, hot flashes, night sweats, mood issues, insomnia, joint pain. But she can also feel good at the same time in some regard. But also, women can get negative clinical indicators when they start hormone therapy because the body is responding to a therapeutic dose. So, a woman can get breast tenderness and they can get a bloaty belly if they're dysbiotic. They might get some swelling or a low level headache. Not all women, but these would be considered negative clinical indicators. And it's not surprising in the first phase that women can get these things, which is why we just don't solely go by these things. But they can experience both positive and negative clinical indicators at the same time.
I think that's really important for women to understand because I do see a lot of questions that come in around starting HRT and then what we would call negative clinical indicators popping up, and that confuses women. They think that it's just this upward trajectory of feeling better and better and that there will be nothing negative again.
And no, this is especially during the first phase or two of the hormone balancing process as the body is adapting to an advanced hormone replacement therapy system. See, depending on the hormone replacement therapy system a patient takes, the clinical indicators are slightly different. So when we talk about restoring hormones, we use fourth generation HRT systems. So when you give a woman a low therapeutic dose of estrogen, a couple of things are going to happen. One, in one regard, she's going to feel really good for no real good reason. And a woman tends to get very questionable about this because it's quite positive. And it's not something they're used to, of just feeling good, just a general feeling of feeling good and brain fog lifted. But she'll also get some breast tenderness because she doesn't have enough receptors to tolerate this low therapeutic dose. So those indicators are brought on by the hormone therapy. Most women don't come in with breast tenderness. Breast tenderness tends to be one of those things, a negative clinical indicator that women will get by starting hormone therapy. Then this negative clinical indicator begins to diminish over time as the body produces enough receptors as the body adapts to the dose. So especially during that first phase, women experience several things, negative and positive clinical indicators. And as you mentioned, Maggie, yeah, a lot of women will start hormone therapy and think because their boobs hurt or they're getting bloaty that something's wrong with their hormone therapy, and then they'll make a quick adjustment. And I did that at first, especially when I did the Wiley protocol. I mean, my boobs hurt so bad. I mean, so bad. Even though I felt on top of the world, I mean, I was just like, part of me just, I didn't care. I felt so good. I didn't care if my boobs hurt. But then after my body adapted to the estrogen, my breast tenderness went away. And as my body adapted to that estrogen, my positive clinical indicators increased on top of that. And this is how it works with hormone balancing, especially in the first phase. It really does take about 3 to 3.5 months for the body to fully adapt to a dose. And this is why, to your point, Maggie, you don't want to make those dosing changes just because you feel breast tenderness. The body needs to adapt. Breast tenderness does not equal bad. It tells us that you're probably taking hormones the right way, because as a hormone coach, I'm expecting it. In the first follow-up with the patient, if they're not experiencing breast tenderness or some form of gut bloating, especially if I know they have gut dysbiosis, I question how they're taking hormones. Because some women will say, oh, my boobs hurt, so I didn't take, my dose this week, or I've been skipping every other week, or however they're taking the hormones or skipping the dose to reduce the breast tenderness.
Yeah,
And
this is
then,
why it's so critical to have a coach through this because again, it's just not that straightforward. There's some ascendancy for sure, feeling better, but there's also some negative things happening at the same time. And personally, if I didn't have a coach going through this, I would have started to dink around with my dosages. I may have given up. I may have thought something was wrong, but I had you to tell me, no, this is normal. This is okay. Stay the course. I think it's really hard for women to stay the course. We get scared. We start questioning. We start thinking that something's wrong. And this is why we see a lot of women who don't get balanced ever.
they don't. And I, like you, I needed a coach. I mean, we were floundering with this. I mean, we had some vague coaching from Wiley herself, but she didn't have a whole lot of patience for clinical coaching. She was like, I already told you what to do. Why aren't you doing it? I was like, yeah, it wasn't until I had a pharmacist, a compounding pharmacist who formulated the Wiley protocol. He walked me through this. And I tell you, I could not have done it, like you said, because I was making those mistakes. I was only taking half the dose. Yes, I can reduce. When I lowered my estrogen and only took half my dose, I reduced my breast pain in the moment. But now I'm only taking half a dose. Now I'm completely off the protocol. Now I'm like taking a low dose. And so it wasn't until, my coach was like, okay, this is how you take the hormones, and you take them in this way, and you need to expect some negative clinical indicators, but you also need to expect that they will diminish, and that you should also expect some positive clinical indicators and expect those to increase. But once I knew what was the future held, how long I was going to have breast tenderness, or how long, it made it a whole lot easier to tolerate it. So yeah, finally, when I had a coach walk me through this, then now I knew I didn't have to worry about a thing. I knew that I was on the right track. And this is what I tell patients in this follow-up appointment from starting HRT. I just, if your boobs didn't hurt, I would question your dose. And so it's expect negative clinical indicators are expected, especially the first time a woman starts HRT, in addition to her positive clinical indicators.
Could you talk a little bit more about the gut in this and how that can get worse before it gets better and why?
Yeah, for years, the A4M did not talk about gut health. The American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, the Institute for Functional Medicine really brought it to the forefront on how the gut health impacts hormone balancing and the hormones. And one of the things that is super critical, in especially in advanced hormone balancing, is when you take a therapeutic dose HRT protocol, it's a good dose. It's not a minuscule dose. It's not a playing around just to appease you. It means business. And the goal of the therapeutic dose is to get some estrogen into your bloodstream. Women who have gut dysbiosis typically store estrogen in their tissues and their fat because they have a malfunctioning estrobolome. The estrobolome is a small subset of gut genes that are responsible for preparing estrogen for processing, for elimination. If the estrobolome is malfunctioning, and the malfunctioning is due to estrogen deficiency, low circulating estrogen. So if the body isn't able to process estrogen in a timely fashion, then the body will want to store this estrogen. It stores it in fat, in tissues, the gut, further shutting down the estrobolome, in the colon. And typically these women are constipated. And so they're storing their estrogen not only in their stool, but their colon will suck that estrogen, absorb that estrogen out of the stool and back into the tissues. And estrogen will even travel up the colon and into the gut and further shut down the estrobolome. When you give women who are, and this is what we would refer to as a type of estrogen dominance, the concept of estrogen dominance is, even though that's not necessarily really a thing, but we consider it something to be that women are storing estrogen in their body and are not able to get rid of it. And when you give these women therapeutic dose HRT, we found that this is a lot of estrogen in the body. And so we can't give an advanced HRT system to a woman who is at stage 3 or 4 gut dysbiosis. So we address the gut dysbiosis, and this would be a category 4 patient, and they would be in the Panacea hormone diet program, because we have to focus solely in the first few months on turning gut health around. So gut health is super critical in the clinical efficacy of any HRT system a woman takes. And this is why it's always addressed first and foremost.
So that's really interesting because I think most women, myself included, at one point, would think that the HRT sort of is a thing unto itself. It's sort of taken in a vacuum and has nothing to do with our gut or mental health or things like that.
Yeah, and we weren't taught that. These are things that some of the things that we were stumbling upon. This is why our protocol is so good, because it was an evolutionary process of discovery. of discovering this. It's like, that's why we track clinical indicators. Why are we putting 5 different women on the same HRT system, but we're getting different clinical responses? Why is that? And so this is when I was watching the patterns. These patients here they're at the same hormone, they're at the same blood levels as everybody else, but they're having more problems. Why? What's the difference between this patient and this patient? This patient has no problems whatsoever, not complaining, no gut problems, and this one does. And so we had to take a look, what were the differentiating factors? Because there's several clinical criteria that determines this patient clinical category that we'll get into in another episode. And we look at, the first thing on that list is gut health. And, where does this patient stand with their gut health? And we just stopped giving. We used to just say, okay, we'll take the hormones. It'll help you feel better and it'll help you change your diet. But it didn't work out that way. I was one of those. I was a category 4 patient who had severe gut dysbiosis, which is why I had a lot of negative clinical indicators in the beginning, because I had severe gut dysbiosis. You give me those therapeutic dose hormones and I thought I was going to die. My boobs hurt so bad. Just the wind coming through the window. I remember distinctly standing in the kitchen and the wind came through and I was like, oh, I just remember just kind of holding myself going, oh my gosh, that's too strong of a wind. Shut the window. I mean, it was just, that's how sensitive it was. But at the same time, I just felt so good. And I was like, had this energy throughout my day. And so it was just this conflicting thing. But really, the positive clinical indicators kind of, trump all the negative ones, in my opinion.
So just quickly, if you could sort of enumerate, in addition to breast tenderness, what are some of the classic, and the gut issues, what are some of the classic negative indicators?
Okay, so the negative clinical indicators, the patient can already come in with them. But I think what you're asking me is, what negative clinical indicators can the patient experience when they start hormone therapy?
Yes.
And this is really about how much estrogen a woman is coming in with when she starts. Is she completely deficient? Because she'll have a different response. If a woman has been very healthy the majority of her life, and she's exercised most every day, sleeps when the sun is down, good farm to table organic diet, plenty of sunshine, good sex, lots of good sex, those types of things, then they don't have such a negative response when they lose their estrogen, but they feel it. And they know something is up and they don't want to experience feeling cruddy because they're not used to feeling cruddy. So these women, they'll get on hormone therapy, but they don't have the profound effect like women in a category 4 or 5 like me, because they haven't been without hormones long. Their negative clinical indicators wouldn't be as severe as, say, a category 4 patient when they're just starting off on the hormones. And these can be, and I know it was for me, really they're about 4 or 5 basic ones that women can expect, especially when they take therapeutic dose HRT. Bloating. But the bloating is as the body is adapting. This isn't a forever thing. It's temporary as the body is adapting to the hormones, as the gut is healing. Rarely do we find people that are just coming in with a happy-go-lucky gut. Most women have some form of gut dysbiosis, not all. So then the negative clinical indicators for category 4 person who's needs to lose a lot of weight, they have gut dysbiosis, they have a poor diet, and these things will make those worse. Headaches, bloating, some people get swelling or water retention. Those are the main things. And those are to be expected. And like I said, as a coach, I look for those things. I'm expecting them. So the first conversation I have is, tell me how you're feeling. And, if it's things that are really bothering them, the patient will say, oh, my boobs hurt, or this hurts, or, my gut's bloaty. Oh, another one of those things. Some patients will gain weight temporarily, especially if a woman has gut dysbiosis. And this is really important to understand. And this is what happened to me. And we couldn't figure out why I was gaining weight on hormone therapy and most women were not. In fact, they were losing weight. And this is how when I was figuring out the clinical categories, it's like, Why are these women gaining weight and these women are not gaining weight? Well, these women who gained weight had more or a severe gut dysbiosis, like what I did. But it was very difficult for me to change my diet before starting hormone therapy. And I didn't really realize the power estrogen had with my cravings and my gut health. So even though I was having these negative clinical indicators, my gut was healing. And as my gut was healing, I was feeling better.
So let's talk about the good stuff, the positive clinical indicators. Tell us more about that.
I love talking about the positive clinical indicators. What's nice about fourth generation HRT that's different than first and second generation HRT is when you start hormone therapy, you'll experience positive clinical indicators. And for some women, it's very life changing to not experience depression all of a sudden, to not experience anxiety, to not have meltdowns, to not be responsive, to be out of proportion with responses, to be stable in mood, to be connected, to be happy. There's a resculpting that takes place where the muscle tone comes back that resculpts the body, and then the fat starts coming off. And so there's a densing of the bones. I mean, there's so many things taking place during this process, but I think one of my most favorite things is the mood stabilizes. The depression for me, the only time I get depression or anxiety or any mental illness for that matter is when my estrogen drops below some 200 pushes it for me. If my estrogen drops below 200, I'm guaranteed a mental illness diagnosis. So it's nice to never have to worry about that. I mean, that's why there's such a strong link between estrogen and mental health. When you've lived with mental illness your entire life, then you get a good dose of estrogen and now it's all gone. And you're like, well, what was all that about?
So is there a point where the negative clinical indicators are going down, the positive clinical indicators are going up? Does this tell you something about where a woman is towards the hormone sweet spot?
Oh, yes. These are some of the patterns that we've learned over the years, where the first phase is a little rocky. As I mentioned, it can get a little bumpy with negative clinical indicators, and positive clinical indicators is kind of like up, down, up, down, up, down. And then there's a leveling out. So by the time a patient's in stage 2, especially later stage 2 to the sweet spot, they're just can't imagine feeling better. And once the labs are all in the right ranges, meaning the estrogen's in the optimal range, which is in the 80 to 90 percentile of the standard reference range, progesterone's in the optimal range, testosterone, thyroid, all the hormones are hovering in the optimal range. And when all these hormones are working together, the positive clinical indicators are just more enhanced and the negative ones are diminishing. And as this happens, we know that the patient's getting closer and closer to the sweet spot, because what we see is that clinical indicator assessment is a scoring system. And the highest score a woman can get is, say, 200 from 0 to 4 on 50 clinical indicators. And so as a woman goes through the panacea process, is what we call it, to the sweet spot, as women are absorbing the hormones or taking the hormones in or adapting to the hormone, the clinical indicator score starts to diminish. See, it's not uncommon for women to come into the clinic with a clinical indicator score over 100. And then her estrogen is in the not even traceable on the labs or even in the double digits, and her FSH is, high. And so what we noticed was as estrogen became more optimal and FSH became optimal, the clinical indicator score started to diminish. And that's what we expect. And we saw such consistency out of this that it's just very dependable. And pretty soon I was able to trust it. In the beginning, I wasn't trusting it. Like when I would ask the doctor, is the patient still having headaches? Okay, we're going to increase their dose and the headaches will go away. And I would say, how do you know for sure? Why do you say that for sure? And they're like, why don't you know that for sure? You're the one tracking the data. And I'm just like, guess what? You're so confident. And then pretty soon I had to get confident with it because it's just something that happens. I mean, it's like patient after patient after patient. And then that gets me back into the question, Maggie, why can't we find this in the National Library of Medicine? Where's the data on this? If we can figure this out with a simple Likert scoring system and lab work, that we can see, oh, well, we can suppress that clinical indicator score under 25 when we get all the labs in the optimal ranges. And then that's just the starting point there. And then the patient just feels better and better and better and better as each month passes. They're on a therapeutic dose HRT system. So as the body adapts to the hormones, the negative clinical indicators diminish and the positive clinical indicators increase and get better and better and better.
I just want to emphasize that this is not an overnight process because, again, I think this trips up a lot of women that they hear this and they're so excited to experience the positive clinical indicators that they think something's not working. So this is not an overnight process, and it's a stepped process. Could you just explain that once again, just a little recap of that?
We want estrogen to be in a certain range in a woman, but you can't just load her up with estrogen all of a sudden to get those levels. We've done that. We've tried just about everything. And then we found it doesn't work. Women will lose their hair. They'll get a bunch of acne. They'll get fat. They'll freak out because they're losing their hair and they're getting fat. And that's a whole nother thing. And so you can't do that. I mean, hormones really need to be dosed precisely and titrated, and the body needs to adapt to that dose. And this takes place over time. And we have learned that it takes about 3 to 3.5 months for the body to fully adapt to a dose. And then we take a clinical indicator assessment at that time, and we draw blood in real time at the same time. And then that's how we know where the patient is in this process over time. So a patient always knows where they are in the process, what phase that they are, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And so as the patient goes through the process, they feel much better. And I'll get into the phases here in just a moment. But there are many things that could influence these clinical indicators, not just the hormones. That's why it's important to go to somebody who knows what they're doing with hormones so that they can decipher what's an HRT related negative clinical indicator, and then what's this negative clinical indicator really related to. So there are several different things that can cause negative clinical indicators. What a woman eats can actually make the hormones work worse. If supplements, if a woman is continuously flushing her liver, her estrogen out of her body, she won't feel good. She'll have negative clinical indicators. If she takes too much testosterone, she'll get negative clinical indicators, but yet her estrogen levels, it'll feel like she's not on estrogen at all, but yet her estrogen will be in the right range. So you can't just go by the estrogen range when the patient has a slew of negative clinical indicators related to estrogen. So how a person sleeps, how they live their life, if they exercise or not, these all contribute to the severity of a clinical indicator. Medications can stop hormones working, that can cause negative clinical indicators. Gut dysbiosis, as I mentioned, stress levels can cause negative clinical indicators. And it's really important that we know this because when the doctor is trying to fine tune the hormone dosing, they're paying attention to these indicators. They're like clues, like fine tuning a piano. You've heard me say 100 times. It's like when the patient's complaining about something, a negative clinical indicator, the doctor is educated. Hopefully they're trained and educated to know what negative clinical indicators corresponds to which hormone. And so that's why it's important to make sure you have the diet and the lifestyle right. So we are minimizing the negative clinical indicators that are related to that. We want to isolate the clinical indicators to that of the hormone therapy so that we know, okay, we need to adjust this hormone. It takes about 3 to 3.5 cycles to see if the body adapted to that. And then what result did we get from that? Oh, that seemed to have done the trick. And this is how you know, Maggie, that we found that sweet spot. When we make another dosing adjustment and then we go beyond the sweet spot, then the patient will feel a different type of negative clinical indicator than what they experienced when they were hormonally deficient. So having too much estrogen has negative clinical indicators. Having too little estrogen has negative clinical indicators. They're similar, but different, such as headaches, different head. You get a headache with too much and you get a headache with too little, but they're different types of headaches in different locations. And the goal is to get those hormones just right. And so that's why it's so important to monitor clinical indicators in addition, in conjunction with lab work, so that we can fine tune those hormones in like a piano. Our goal is to get those hormones dialed into the hormone sweet spot and then maintain those levels there for life.
Hmm. You alluded to this before, but have you seen any differences with clinical indicators as it relates to the different generations of HRT protocols?
Oh, yeah. So I've mostly worked with second generation on up. I haven't done a whole lot of work with first generation, synthetic hormones or low static dose hormones, because I got into the industry when they were introducing bioidenticals with Suzanne Summers, the big movement. And this is what really made us pay attention to the indicators, because as I mentioned, with low dose, like say patch therapy, for example, a patient will feel good when they start taking it, especially an extremely estrogen deficient woman. But that feel goodness wears off and the patient will go back to feeling horrible. And this is just in the first phase of treatment. The third generation, say a Wiley protocol, it was a little trickier to dial in to get rid of the negative clinical indicators. See, the goal of the clinician, the prescriber, is to use an HRT system like a tool to fix things, to tweak, make her feel better, make her feel less worse, make her feel better, get rid of this negative symptom. And so that's what these hormones are designed to do. They're tools in an arsenal to dial in. And we need to know how a woman is feeling, and we need to know where her blood work is. Because a woman can feel absolutely wonderful, as you mentioned, but her estrogen will be low. And that's with a lot of women. When we say, oh, okay, well, you have a good clinical indicator score, but your labs aren't where they should be, even though you feel good, we're going to adjust your, say, estrogen. We're going to tweak that and sit on that for about 3 to 3.5 months, and then check your clinical indicator score and lab work. And many women will say, well, I don't know why I need more estrogen. I've never felt as good as this. But because we know where those labs need to be for a woman to really feel the full benefits of those hormones, the patient doesn't even know how good they can feel. You've just given them a little bit and they just feel like they've died and gone to heaven. They have no idea how good they're going to feel until you give them a good tweak, because they haven't been on that dose long enough to experience the negative clinical indicators that eventually come, because the brain and body require more than that dose. They just don't know it yet. And so our goal is to continue to tweak until the labs are in the right range and the clinical indicator score is suppressed where it needs to be. Both of those things have to happen for full and true hormonal balance. And that's why we call it the sweet spot, because it is. It's like Goldilocks. There's too much, too little, and just right.
Hmm. So sometimes when women say that their HRT stopped working, that's probably what they're referring to, what you were just discussing, that they felt good, they had enough for the time being, but their doctor didn't know that this needed to be continuously titrated. So is that what's
Yes.
happening?
Yes. And that's when the doctor really doesn't have much training. They just really aren't going anywhere with it. It's just low dose symptoms management. And most doctors know that they will still have to prescribe psychotropic drugs and other things, treatment surgeries and other things to manage what the hormones aren't taken care of. And you have mentioned these phases. When a woman is on a fourth generation HRT system, that first phase, our sole goal in that first phase is to build a foundation of main sex hormones, mostly estrogen and progesterone in this phase. And like I said, it can be a little rocky in this phase as the body adapts. Feel good, oh, not so good, but still feel good. The second phase, as the body has adapted more to the hormones, then there's less negative clinical indicators through phase 2. Our job here in phase 2 is to fine tune those hormones and bring on any other hormones that need to be addressed now that the foundational hormones have been fully restored. And this is usually takes about 6 to 9 months during the second phase. And as part of the process. And then once the hormone sweet spot has been achieved, where we have virtually no negative clinical indicators and all the lab work is hovering in the optimal range, our goal is just to establish the hormone sweet spot and maintain this sweet spot for life. And we can do that for many, 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 many years for women. But usually there's always something that happens in a woman's life that can bump her off track. This is another reason monitoring clinical indicators is important. Because even with me, I'll start to feel negative clinical indicators, or a patient can feel negative clinical indicators. And it's like, well, what's going on? My hormones are balanced. Why am I getting headaches? Why is this happening? And we're like, we don't know. Let's take your blood work. But without those clues, we wouldn't know that there was something going on with the hormones. And most likely we see that there's a decline in a hormone. Usually it's estrogen. And so we'd figure out what's going on with estrogen. Why did this drop? Because you can maintain those levels pretty well if you got it dialed in right with the right HRT system. But there are many things that can bump a woman out of their hormone balance, out of that sweet spot. Stress is one of those things. And where a patient can have adequate estrogen levels, but she'll feel like she doesn't have any hormones at all. So if we see a low clinical indicator score and estrogen and FSH are in the optimal range, we start digging, okay, what's going on? Did you lose a job, get married? Was there, a death in the family? I mean, these major things will can affect estrogen from working.
Right.
And so
that those would indicate a high clinical indicator score. So if estrogen's in range, but the clinical indicators suddenly shoot up.
Yeah, we're like, okay, so what's going on here? Your estrogen looks good. Either one, why aren't you accessing it? That's one thing. If the stress is too much, the cortisol can be too high, and women, and that renders estrogen useless. So we see what's the extent of the stress, and then we analyze how long is this stress going to be. What's going on. Is this a timely, like a move across the globe? That's stressful. That takes time. And so the patient might need to take some cortisol to help give them a little boost during this time to help them feel better. And they're not in this state of adrenal crisis. And they actually have that cortisol boost until the crisis is over. Then you drop the cortisol and then let the estrogen get back to work again. So there's different ways to address when the hormones get out of balance. But the determining factor of balance or out of balance is those two criteria, the lab work and the clinical indicator score. So there's really never a time a woman should ever be hormonally out of balance. So if there's clues that indicate a patient's out of balance, well, then we check lab work and we confirm it. And in that way, we always know, and we always know when to get the patient back into the sweet spot. Because there's really never a day in a woman's life where she feels good without enough estrogen and enough hormones. So we want to get that dialed in and have a woman be hormonally balanced for the majority of her life until the day she dies.
So how do we actually measure the clinical indicators? We've been talking about scores, but could you sort of lay it out real clearly how these get measured?
So when a patient is on a therapeutic dose, a fourth generation HRT system, we first take a clinical indicator assessment when we get started. And usually we see this number get pretty close to somewhere between 100 and 200 is kind of the average. Women feel pretty cruddy when their hormones are low. And then we take an initial panel. And this is our baseline. And then we start hormone replacement therapy and allow the body to adapt to this initial dose. Then we usually take a lab test and a clinical indicator assessment at about a 6-week mark. We do this at this time because we want to make sure the patient isn't allergic to any of the ingredients. And we also want to see from the dose they were given what we were able to yield out of the blood work. So with this particular dose, what were we able to get just from this 6 weeks, just this, it's actually about 4 weeks. Then we measure and then we see the patient about a couple of weeks later. And then it gives us an idea about how much estrogen, for example, this patient has and how they feel. So they just have this much estrogen and their clinical indicator score is this. Well, so we'll already see a change in the clinical indicator score in these 4 weeks. And then so usually at this time, there's a dosing adjustment. And then we sit on this for about 3 to 3.5 months. And when we take a clinical indicator score, it drops down as the estrogen and FSH. The FSH drops down and the estrogen gets to where it needs to be in the optimal range. And so you just really, this is just done indefinitely. We always want to know. I don't think a woman should ever have to guess where she is hormonally speaking. It's easily measurable. It's something that should be measured once every 4 months. When we were first figuring this out, we didn't know what was that interval, 3 months, 2 months, every month, 6 months, a year, because they were telling us in the beginning a year, oh, just give the patient a year's worth of hormones and test them once a year. Okay, so that wasn't working. So we'd go back and say, okay, that doesn't work out very well because patients have a lot of questions. I mean, you really want us to give them a year's worth of hormones and don't see them for a year? I mean, it just wasn't reasonable. And that was part of the frustration with this too, is we would learn something, then we take it back to the clinic and it's like, has anybody even tested this clinically? Because it's not working for us. And then if we felt like it was us, then I would just go pick every doctor's brain at the conferences and say, okay, what happens when you experience this? What do you do? How do you handle it? And then eventually we came to find out, well, nobody knows. So now we're going to have to figure it out on our own. And that's why we started doing this score, monitoring how a person feels in real time. And like I said, and that's also how we found out how we know estrogen works in real time.
So the clinical indicator assessment has like 50 different indicators, headaches, things like that, and it's a scoring from 0 to 4. And so if the clinical indicator assessment score is high, we know that something's off for a woman.
Yes. And then there's what if the labs look good and the indicator's high? And then that's why it's important to have a coach and a hormone doctor who's trained, because hormone restoration isn't a forever ending adjustment exercise wheel. There is a place of destination where each hormone performs its best. And as I mentioned, there are many other things that can cause negative clinical indicators, not just hormones. So you can't always throw that into the wastebasket of, oh, you're feeling bad, it must be the hormones. And so we want to test at least once every 4 months to make sure the patient's doing well. And if something comes up, like if a patient's in the middle of their interval, they're not going to see us for 4 months. And in the middle of that, they start complaining of things like maybe some excessive uterine bleeding, which is rare, or getting migraines or something like that. Well, that's like, okay, what's going on? You shouldn't have that if you have enough estrogen. This is how much estrogen affects a woman, to the point where we know if a woman is getting a migraine, then her estrogen is probably deficient. This is how our entire medical system should know this and be this confident about it. It's just, oh, you're getting migraines. Well, we usually only see that in estrogen deficient women.
What I love about what you share in these episodes, Marie, is the process of how you in the clinic came to understand how this works and how these pieces go together. And it's really practical. I mean, to be measuring the clinical indicators through this assessment and then taking the labs in real time and looking at those two things together, that's a really practical approach. And I can see why you often say, if you can figure this out, why hasn't the overall medical establishment figured it out? And that remains a mystery. Maybe the medical establishment likes to overcomplicate things. I don't know.
Well, yeah, as long as you can keep a woman away from estrogen, you've got a lot of mental illness diagnoses that the pharmaceutical company can make a lot of money on. When I was looking for documents and studies to support what we've discovered, it's like, where are they? Why isn't this here? That's why I like Dr. Robert Wilson's book, Feminine Forever, so much, because he was doing this in his clinic in the 50s and 60s. He was figuring this out then. But then when the big pharma found out that, well, gosh, if you just restore the hormones, women don't go crazy. They don't have mental illness diagnoses. They just pulled his studies, wouldn't publish his book again, and pretty much canceled him. So hopefully today, everybody listening would learn a little bit about what clinical indicators are, how to measure them with lab work, and to know that it takes more than hormone replacement therapy to feel good. But also, just because a woman doesn't feel good doesn't necessarily mean it's a hormone thing. This is why it's so important to go to somebody who knows what they're doing, who understands what to look for, who understands every dosing adjustment. We have an expectation on how that female body will respond. And the doctors need to understand this. And if they're not trained, they won't know what to look for. They won't know to pay attention to those clues. And that's why in our physician training program, we spend some time on these clinical indicators, and that works with clinical categories. And I'm excited to talk about that in another episode, and how the clinical indicators work differently with the different clinical categories of patients. So as you can see, restoring hormones, balancing hormones is more than just slapping a patch on a woman's ass and sending her out the door. It's more than that.
Yeah, just before I was saying that it was simple, the clinical indicators and the lab work. So that's what I mean. It's simple in that sense, in that it's obvious and very practical, but it is extremely nuanced, and it takes a lot of expertise and a lot of clinical experience, which is again why you're such a wealth of information, because you have that clinical experience and you've done the trial and error on yourself and with thousands of patients. And so you've got a body of evidence here that backs up what you're talking about.
For me, the selling point was the clinical response, what I saw with my own eyes with women over and over and over and over and over. And it's like, this is crazy. How come we don't have data on this? Here's what I want you to take away from this episode. Hormone balancing isn't something that's done to you. It's something that you do with a team of people who know what they're doing. You can't just slap a patch on and think you're going to get your own hormones balanced. Your body is consistently communicating with you and how it feels. So it speaks through your energy, your mood, your behavior, and your overall sense of happiness. So learning to read those cues is super important. Read your body. Do you have headaches? Do you have insomnia? Do you have a joint pain? Well, those are all symptoms of estrogen deficiency. Even if you are taking HRT, that's a pretty good indication that you're not on the right dose or on the right HRT system. So if it ever feels like something is off, pay attention. And actually, we have our clinical indicator assessment. We have that posted on our website. You can go to hormonebalancetest.com and fill out your own clinical indicator assessment. This is the one we use in the clinic. I just renamed it Hormone Balance Test for something easy to remember. But it's a great way to see where you are. And if you have current labs, then you can measure those up against labs. Or if you know you're going to take labs that morning, go take the hormone balance test, get your labs done, and then book a consultation, and let's review those, and you can see where you are with your hormonal balance.
Okay, Marie, it's time for some hormone coaching by you, our expert hormone coach. I'm going to read a couple of listener questions, and I'd love for you to hear them as a hormone coach and give your advice. So here's our first one. I just turned 50 and started HRT this past Saturday for night sweats, hot flashes, insomnia, and anxiety. My doctor prescribed 0.025 estradiol patch twice a week with 100 milligrams of progesterone daily at night. I'm having increased night sweats and waking 2 to 3 times a night and waking super early, which is worse than it was before starting the medicine. Is this normal in the beginning?
It is if you go to a doctor who doesn't know what they're doing. It is normal. It's actually a very normal protocol, is to put the patient on a low dose patch along with progesterone every day. Now, this is not physiologic. This protocol does not match a woman's natural physiology of her body. The low dose patch twice a week is much too low. The dose is high enough to shut down ovarian production, but it's not high enough to make a woman feel good. So there's some changes that are taking place here. Taking progesterone every day disrupts their circadian rhythm. It disrupts the menstrual cycle. It disrupts the cycle. Women produce progesterone in real measurable amounts days 14 through 28. Given progesterone every day does not mimic the natural physiology of progesterone's production. And so the other notable thing is, in order for women to tolerate progesterone, or for progesterone to work as the secondary calming, supportive, complementary hormone to estrogen, there has to be enough circulating estrogen in a woman's blood. And doctors who are not educated on estrogen, this is the protocol they prescribe: low dose estrogen and then progesterone. One of the reasons this woman is having so many problems is because the dose of her patch can be lower than what she was actually producing on her own to begin with. So this is how women can feel cruddy when they start HRT, because their dose is too low. The brain and body of a woman require plenty of estrogen, and you just really can't get that through patch therapy. I mean, well, you can, but you'd have to take a lot of patches. And I mean, there have been a couple times, and in cases of an emergency, women don't get access to, what we really want. We've had to go that route with patches. Okay, take these 8 patches. Well, not that bad, but it's like a lot of patches. They're just better protocols to get estrogen into the system. And the problem with patch therapy is there's no real education on it. Doctors are just reading the package insert and saying, okay, take these, change them out twice a week. This protocol has never been sustainable. It's sustainable for the doctor and the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, because you keep the hormones low. The patient is told they're on hormones, so just to shut up about it, and it's just not working for them. And then to take the psychotropic drug cocktails and purchase the supplements. And this is where women are left. And so when she asks, is this normal in the beginning? Yeah, if you're on a second generation HRT protocol, like you're on. In fact, it's not going to get much better. If you ask for a higher dose estrogen, you may get a higher dose, but that doesn't mean your doctor knows what they're doing. They're just going to appease you and give you a higher dose. There's nobody in charge here. There's no clinical destination. Nobody knows where they're going. If you were to take blood work at this point, it's almost useless because the doctor doesn't even know where they're going with it. Every hormone has its own optimal range where the patient does best. And if your doctor doesn't know this, where are we going? What's the destination? This is why it's important to go to somebody who says, okay, yeah, this is a destination, and this is how long it's going to take, and it's a process. And this is, and everybody's on the same page. We're going to start here, titrate your dose up so you can adapt to it. But these low dose patches, they just, they may work for a little bit in the beginning for some women, but for some women, they don't even work at all, like the case with this poor woman. And if she continues to go to doctors like this, she will spend the next 20 years of her life if she doesn't get a clue on this. If she doesn't find somebody educated, that's the big thing. You can't just go to doctors who read the package insert for their education. And it has to be training that's specifically for full restoration, not minuscule low dose to keep the patient in a state of deficiency. How to fully restore a woman's empty estrogen tank, her empty progesterone tank, her empty thyroid tank, her empty testosterone tank, all the hormones that are needed. Yeah, I feel bad for these women. There's these types of questions almost verbatim are in a lot of these Facebook groups where these women are trying to do this, on their own.
Well, right. So a question like this would probably get, 20 different answers from other women who are having an experience that they're sharing, and that just further confuses women, I think. And as you were talking and giving your answer to this, it also occurred to me that unfortunately this woman will probably eventually say, yeah, HRT didn't work for me, and just go off.
Or the doctor will talk her off of it because they will not be forthcoming with her lack of training and education, and they don't know what to do, because she will max out. She'll ask for more estrogen until she maxes out on that patch, and then or until she starts spotting, and then the doctor will freak out and lower her dose, and then that's where she's stuck. But in these groups, if I were to answer this question the same way that I answered to you in these groups, I'd get ridiculed. Even if somebody who knows what they're doing gives an answer, nobody would know that unless it makes sense to somebody. And I found this, I'll make a comment in it, or I used to, I don't so much anymore. But somebody will just rip me apart. What the hell do you know? And then there'll be some women that are going, oh my gosh, you've made the most sense of anybody ever.
Yeah.
And they usually reach out to me and want to know more information. But yeah, this is why it's so important for women to understand how their body works, how to measure how they feel, and using labs and how you feel. Otherwise, it's just this nonstop exercise wheel of just getting nowhere at a woman's emotional expense, her behavioral expense, her physical expense, her mood expense, her financial expense, everything.
So this next question is a little bit convoluted, and I selected it in part for that reason, because I think you're going to have some interesting comment just overall. So follow along here. I'm
Okay.
51. I'm 5 years or so post-menopause. As I understand it, that's the correct term. I haven't had a menstrual cycle in 5 years or so. How do I know if I would need hormone therapy? Or is it possible to not require hormone therapy? I've got a lot of autoimmune diseases. I've got a lot of diagnosed medical conditions, diseases, and syndromes, and I have a lot of physical illnesses. Is it possible that I'm used to feeling like crap all the time and I'm used to nothing working properly on my body, that menopause didn't phase me? I don't know that I have the flu or that I'm sick unless there is an obvious physical symptom like I'm vomiting or there's some bizarre rash. As an example, I didn't realize that the nerve pain I was experiencing, the numbness in my face, the fact that half my head was frozen and that I couldn't lift my arm was from shingles, because to me that was just, I probably slept wrong that night. That's how my medical conditions work. So I had no idea it was shingles until I saw a rash. I don't get rashes, so that's how I knew. I have no idea if I'm sick with the flu or a virus unless I'm vomiting. All other symptoms are everyday symptoms that I experience from other conditions. So how do I know if I would benefit from hormone therapy other than trial and error, I suppose?
So that's the thought process of a estrogen deficient woman, is just all over the place. And well, let me start at the beginning. So she's 51 and she's postmenopause 5 years. That means that she started menopause, 46, which is very common. People talk about menopause starting at around age 51. No, clinically, what we've seen over the past couple of decades is this age is getting younger and younger and younger. And yeah, it's called postmenopause. And so when a woman has gone this long without estrogen, she does not feel good. Her brain doesn't work, and she becomes susceptible to a whole slew of diseases, including autoimmune diseases, even if she was never susceptible premenopause. Estrogen deficiency can make a woman a sitting duck for autoimmune disease. And that's super critical to know. Now, she wanted to know, how do I know if I need hormone therapy? Absolutely every woman benefits from estrogen. If you don't have any, you will benefit from it, most likely. Some women are so unhealthy that they will have negative clinical indicators, as I mentioned, when they start hormone therapy. And they'll think it's because the hormone therapy, they won't realize it's all their conditions are coming in with. It's making it difficult for estrogen to work. And these women need more hand holding, which is why there's a separate program for she would be considered a category 5 patient because of all the complications she has in addition to needing her hormone therapy. Because when you give a woman like this hormone replacement therapy, it will influence absolutely everything she's talking about, mostly for the better if she changes her diet and lifestyle. And this is the things that she's going through. Part of it is because she's estrogen deficient, and part of it is because she probably has a poor diet and lifestyle, like most women do when they're hormonally deficient, because they lack the will to live. They don't feel good. And as she mentions, I don't know if I'm used to just feeling like crap all the time. That's what women typically experience, feeling like crap all the time. They don't know what's hormonally related or if their body's just falling apart. But in essence, all of it, Estrogen prevents the brain and body from falling apart. It prevents disease. It prevents conditions. The smartest thing this woman can do would be to get on some hormones, to get on some good estrogen. It would reverse so many things for her and clear it all out so that you can see what's really going on. And Maggie, you and I have talked about this before with if doctors just went in as first line therapy, fully restoring a woman's empty hormone tank and let the dust settle. And then you'd get a better picture of what the patient is really up against with regards to medical conditions instead of hormone deficiency induced illnesses, which is what I think that this woman is. Well, I'm not a doctor and I don't want to speculate to that, but what I've seen is when women have plenty of estrogen, they don't have these conditions or not as severe or significantly improved. But, her main question here is, so how do I know if I can benefit from hormone therapy other than a trial and error, I suppose? It's going to depend on which HRT system she's on. And she will most likely go to a doctor who's, if they're trained in second generation HRT, so she will get a low dose. And as I mentioned, it'll stop working as they do because she'll be underdosed. She's post menopause 5 years. Her body's been starving for estrogen for a long time. And so this patient will go through a longer process than, say, a category 1 through 3 patient. The final note on this, every woman benefits from estrogen. Every woman benefits from hormone replacement therapy. It's just making sure that you're getting enough of the right hormones at the right time.
Thanks, Marie, for answering those questions. And I want to say to our listeners, if there's something you'd like us to consider discussing on the MeNoPause Moxie podcast, you can DM Marie directly on social media or go to menopausemoxie.com/podcast and use the form at the bottom of the page. We'd love to hear your questions, and I'd love to be able to bring them forth for Marie to answer as a hormone coach.
Thanks so much, Maggie. If you're experiencing negative clinical indicators, hormone therapy or not, go to hormonebalancetest.com and fill out your own clinical indicator assessment. You'll also have the opportunity to book a discovery session to review those results and to see if one of our hormone balancing programs is a good fit for you. So thanks for joining us today. Please subscribe and share this with people that you think would benefit from it. Remember, everybody benefits when your hormones are balanced. I'm Marie Hoig, and this is the MeNoPause Moxie Podcast.